Welcome back to Michael Coren, our Foreign Affairs panel. We segued on to the United Nations there, and the perception of the UN. I mean, does the United Nations do a good job? Is it worth having?
I'm in the middle of reading a book now on the United Nations, and you cannot believe the corruption, the graft, the stealing, the lack of accountability. I mean, the list is endless.
Who's the book by?
It's by a Fox News reporter, Shaw, I think his name was.
Right. I mean, it could be argued that there's a certain agenda there.
In the UN?
But Fox has an agenda just like CNN and ABC and NBC and CBC does. I just wish they'd all admit that they had one.
Well, you can look at oil scam. You don't have to sort of throw up the issue of Fox's agenda. There are many, many examples of what the UN does improperly. And he just catalogs them in his book.
Even if there is corruption, there is, without doubt. Even if there is a slanting of the issues, if you can prevent war, if you can get people to speak together rather than kill each other, isn't it worth having such a body?
Except they've never succeeded in their mandate.
Ever?
Ever. What are they doing in Darfur?
The problem with the United Nations is that I think a lot of people see it as an ideal, the idea of United Nations, of people from all different backgrounds and communities coming together to, in the wake of World War II, to talk and discuss how can we prevent war around the world. And I think the problem is that, and I'm not going to, well, maybe I will single out the U.S. here for a moment, but there are other countries who do this. If a powerful nation doesn't get its way at the United Nations, then there's the unilateral approach, and I think that's what the example of the Iraq War was. Most opposition was focused inside the United Nations, but the U.S. decided to go around it. And so if there's no respect for international institutions, if it's a hollow shell that is a talk shop, that there's no, it has no international authority, then what meaning does it have?
By your logic, though, you support the war in Afghanistan.
No.
Well, but you just said the reason for opposing Iraq is because countries can be unilateral. The UN said no. UN said yes to Afghanistan.
I still oppose that. And I said if the UN had supported the war in Iraq, I still would have opposed the war in Iraq. And on those grounds, I oppose the war in Afghanistan.
When the Soviet Union existed, there were 16 republics there. They had all those votes. Yeah, I mean, every dictatorship in the world seemed to be in the same block over and over again. And when you have countries like Scandinavia, Northern Europe, Australasia voting on one side and dictatorships and theocracies on the other, you tend to think maybe one side is better than the other and more to be trusted than the other.
But I don't think it always breaks down along those lines.
Generally did.
Well, the UN is a space for, for politics at a certain level, and the U.S. is, there's an agenda here to try to undermine the UN when it does not fit the certain agendas in Washington, and on the other side, a very convenient way to use it when it does, right? And that's the case in Darfur, that's the case in Afghanistan and Iraq, and so it's a very manipulative game, I believe. I think the UN is a fundamental body. The question is, how do we make it a more democratic body, a more accountable body, more responsive to people's needs and less to, centers of power of the corporations and Washington and the European Union and so on. That's the agenda. So I think this question...
You're too intelligent for this.
Well,
look, yes, corporations use the UN, but you know what? This is when people lose respect for debate. Corporations use the UN, America uses the UN, so does international communism, international Islam, all sorts of groups. So
it's an
condemn
arena.
them all.
Well, I think that the fact is we need to devise a new kind of global governance, not based on, the needs of centers of power and, large corporate interests, but we need to start looking at human rights, we need to look at shared development, we need to look at how we're going to transform the rules of trade and diplomacy so that we can...
That's a fantasy to believe that we are capable of creating such an organization and who would run it and who would vote for it. Looking at the opposition to the Iraq War, it was all based on financial interests of France, Russia, and China. They opposed the United States' desire to attack Iran only because of their own financial reasons, and they sold their votes. I think you cannot avoid the issue of national self-interest, aside from receiving the graft, and I can't imagine any world government that can overcome that.
And if you want to make a government democracy, if you want to make an international organization more democratic, most of the people on your side of the fence are going to lose any authority. Castro will have one vote representing himself. A democracy like the United States or Canada should have as many votes as people are voting in their elections. And most, just as Michael pointed out, you get theologies and dictatorships on one side.
But hold on, also, if you want to talk about sides on your side, Egypt, which if it was a democracy, will probably elect a far more Islamic government. Jordan, an enlightened monarchy, but still not really a full democracy. There are all sorts, Saudi Arabia, there are many, many countries